Hello, and welcome to the HMIS Quick Train for ESG-CV projects. In this video, we're going to cover a lot of topics related to the new ESG-CV funds and how it relates to HMIS. Let's get started. Let's start by talking about ESG-CV project types. Your agency's list of projects might look a little different in HMIS because of these new ESG-CV projects. You might see some new acronyms in the system, so let's just start by covering the basic program acronyms you'll see in HMIS. ESG grants cover 4 basic project types: homelessness prevention, rapid rehousing, emergency shelter, and street outreach. These are the appropriate acronyms for these project types. Your agency may be entering in data for one of these project types, or you may be entering in more than one of these project types. It just depends on which project type your agency has funding for. Let's focus on the first 2 project types for now: homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing. If your agency already has a homelessness prevention project in HMIS and you're now also receiving ESG-CV funds for homelessness prevention, you will need to record which pot of money you're using to serve each client. The same is true for rapid rehousing. So as you enroll a client into an HMIS project, you need to ask yourself, are you using your agency's normal annual ESG funds to serve this client? Or are you using your agency's new CARES Act ESG-CV funding to serve this client? The answer to that question will determine which project you enroll your client into. At the bottom of this slide, you'll see some examples of project names as they will appear in the system. On the left side, the top project is your agency's normal annual ESG homelessness prevention project. And the bottom one is your agency's new ESG-CV homelessness prevention project. You'll see that both of these projects follow the same naming convention. They both start with ESG TDHCA, but only the new CARES Act funding project will have that CV. Next will be the acronym for the project type, and the last thing in the name will be your agency name. I've used the acronym for Texas Homeless Network in my example. Depending on the length of your agency's name, it might be spelled out or it might be an acronym. On the right-hand side, you will see 2 more examples of rapid rehousing projects. You'll see that the naming convention works exactly the same, only the project type acronym is different because this is a different project type. So the added step for you as an HMIS user will be taking a moment before enrolling your client into a program to determine first which pool of funding the client will be served with. So which funds is your agency using to enroll this specific client? Once that's determined, you can choose the appropriate project name from that drop-down on the program enrollment page and enter your client into the appropriate program, either your annual ESG or your ESG-CV. Emergency shelter projects are different and simpler, thankfully, in that they don't require a separate project in HMIS. So if your agency already had an emergency shelter project in the system, and now you're also receiving ESG-CV funds for emergency shelter, there's no need to enroll your client into a separate emergency shelter project. You'll only see the normal annual emergency shelter project that you already have. So your agency will only ever have that one emergency shelter project. HUD isn't concerned with differentiating which pot of money you're using to serve your client for this project type. So your annual ESG emergency shelter project is fine to use even if you're using ESG-CV funds. If you're receiving annual ESG funding for street outreach and also receive ESG-CV funding for street outreach, it's possible that you could have separate projects like homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing, or you could only have the one project like emergency shelter. It all depends on what your funding sources are or where that funding is coming from. If both ESG and ESG-CV comes from the same source, you'll only have the one project. If you get your ESG and ESG-CV from different sources, you'll have more than one street outreach project. The good news is you don't have to keep track of where your funding is coming from. Just know that if your agency does have separate street outreach projects in HMIS, so you have the normal annual ESG as well as an ESG-CV project in HMIS, you'll need to treat them the same as you would a homelessness prevention or rapid rehousing project. There are some new expectations surrounding data collection that you should already be aware of, but we just wanted to reiterate. You are expected to track if you're using the COVID-19 Fair Market Rent or FMR waiver if you're utilizing it. And for homelessness prevention projects, you are expected to determine if the household is below 30% AMFI or 30 to 50% AMFI. Let's talk about some reporting expectations. So you are still responsible for submitting MPRs, and you are now expected to submit 2 MPRs, one for your annual or normal ESG funds, and one for the new ESG-CV funds. So what if you're entering data for a new project type that you didn't have before? This means that your workflow might look a little different. This is due to the fact that each project type has specific data elements that HUD expects you to enter into HMIS. So if you're working with a new project type, your workflow might include a data element that you've never had to enter before, or it might not have data elements that you did have to enter before. The main thing you need to focus on is just finishing the workflow and also entering as much complete data as possible to ensure accurate reporting. And as your HMIS trainer, please don't hesitate to ask questions if you see something you're unsure about. We have lots of videos that we can send your way to help walk you through the new workflow. For the most part, the workflows are very similar from project type to project type, but they do have a few different data elements. One place you might see a new data element is on the program enrollment page. As you know, this is the page where you decide which project you're enrolling your client into. For rapid rehousing and street outreach project types, you'll also see some extra data elements on the right-hand side that you'll be expected to enter later on in your client's enrollment, like this housing move-in date, for example. I also wanted to walk through the differences you'll see while running reports. So here we are on the MPR page in HMIS. As I mentioned earlier, you'll need to submit 2 MPRs now, one for each pot of money if you have both annual ESG funds and ESG-CV funds. So you definitely want to hit that filter by program checkbox and check the specific program you're running this report for. I also wanted to note that when choosing the grant on a report page, which is required here, the grant naming conventions will be exactly the same as the project names. So depending on which project you're running this report for, the grant name should match the project name that you're choosing. No matter what, the main thing I want you to remember about any of these workflows is that you need to complete it. You should continue entering data until you see this page with the word finish and close the workflow underneath it. So this is what we need you to see every time you start any workflow, including an entry workflow, an exit workflow, or an assessment workflow. If you do this step, then you'll be fine. Here's some guidance for reporting on pre-award costs. Subrecipients that utilize the CARES condition allowing for pre-award costs will need to, in one way or another, compile expenses and performance during the time the funds were used. ESG CARES subrecipients have 3 options for their first MPR submission. 1. Service dates starting from first COVID-19 response, no earlier than March 13th, 2020, and ending May 30th, 2020 to reflect pre-award costs. Or 2. Service dates starting from first COVID-19 response no earlier than March 13th, 2020 and ending on June 30th, 2020 to reflect pre-award costs. Or number 3, service dates starting on the official contract start date of May 19th, 2020 and ending on June 30th, 2020. Considering that an ESG-CV project will not be set up until June 30th, Each subrecipient will likely have to tailor the first MPR themselves, utilizing their own manual calculations and tracking. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that we are not expecting HMIS users to enter any backdated data entry. Everything you've learned in this training applies to data entry moving forward. That's everything that I have for you. If any of this wasn't clear or you have any ESG CV questions, please get in touch with us. And thanks for watching.